Hi, good evening. We're just barely still in 2020. Welcome to the winter series of this year entitled Roller Coaster, the State of Israel and the Jewish People in the mid-1980s. Tonight is number 11, lecture number 11 out of 16. The title of tonight's lecture is Religion and Politics, the Age of Rav Shach and Rav Ovadia Yosef. Tonight's talk is being, well, first of all, the whole series is always sponsored every year by the Lehmann family, and we thank them. And tonight's specific sponsor is the other Lehmann family, Harold Lehmann, and his kids, as you see over here, Gil, Amalya, and Ariel, in memory of the late Rivkah Lehmann, who is sorely missed by all of us. Good friend. She would be here telling me what I'm going to say wrong, which was great. And we hope Neshama have Amalya. Let me, as always, thank the tech team, my son over here, Udalab, running the whole operation, Howard Elbab for organizing the PowerPoint, and Yossi Westin for transforming the PowerPoint into something magical. I would just like to say, in general, we're putting this out. Hopefully, this will be ready Motzei Shabbos. This is New Year's weekend, so be sure you watch this video before you go partying or some crazy thing like that. And without any further ado, I think I'll get right down to business, don't you? As I said before, tonight we're talking about religion and politics in the 80s, mid-80s. The subject of religion and politics in Jewish life has been at the heart of the conundrum of Jewish modernity ever since the rise of the secular state at the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th. A lot of fancy words there. There was a time, you'll understand what I mean as I go on. There was a time when Jews, that's a religious category. That is how they regarded themselves, and that is how they were regarded by others, as a religious category. Actually, that's not true. Traditionally, Jews regarded themselves as a distinct nation. It was just that, deprived of land and political state, the only way they could express their common nationhood was through adherence to three things, as we see in the first slide. A common set of religious beliefs, particularly a common version of their own history. That's the heart of what traditional Judaism is. A common literature, and a common set of religious practices. If I wanted to, I could say a common calendar, but that basically is the heart of it. It's what Heinrich Heine called the portable fatherland. With the rise of the secular state, and this starts with the French Revolution and the rise of the French Republic, which was the first secular state ever, the Jews faced the problem of definition. How were they to be defined by the new French state? In plain terms, if they're not French, if they're members of another nation, then get out of France. They should be expelled. Okay? I mean, France is for Frenchmen. Right? You're not French by nationality. If you're a member of another nationality, go somewhere else. It's very famous, as we see in the next slide. Clermont-Tonnerre is often quoted. One of the people that advocated or agreed that Jews should eventually be given complete and total citizenship and civil rights in France in 1790 and 1791, that big controversy. But he basically said if the Jews are allowed to remain in France, they must define themselves. They must define themselves as French by nationality and Jewish only by religion. You know what I just said? If you honestly feel that your is Klal Yisrael, if your nation is Jew, then you're not French. Then don't be honest enough to say so and get out of France. In the course of the 19th century, the Jews did this. They agreed and defined themselves. Were such and such by nationality and Jewish only by religion. They did it in order to get civil rights. Imagine, for example, in Germany, where they didn't want to give the Jews civil rights for such a long time. And the Germans kept saying, you're not German. And the Jews would say, we are German. That's why we should get civil rights. We shouldn't be subjected to discrimination laws and ghettos and things like that. And the Germans said, but you're not Jewish. You're not German. You're a member of another nation. So you see, the Jews had to constantly stress the fact, we're only Jewish by religion. In fact, a lot of people hold this against the Yekas. I don't mean the frum ones, but, German Jews in general. Didn't the Reform movement, for that exact reason, get rid of Zion, Eretz Yisrael, all the things that have to do with Jews being associated with their own country as a different nation? Wasn't it the German Jews who started by saying Berlin is our Jerusalem? Or as the guy said in 1841 in the United States of America, Washington is our Jerusalem, that idiot in Charleston. But was it true that the Jews are only Jewish by religion, not by nationality? Not according to Orthodox Judaism. Orthodox Judaism posits that the Jewish people are primarily an Am Segula, Kol Yisrael V'Eretz Zelazeh, and Jews where they are connected with other Jews as part of a people. We're in exile. We had something, we screwed it up, but we're a nation. Now, one can be sincerely loyal to one's country of residence. Fight in the army, help the country. That is the model of Joseph in Egypt, isn't it? This week is Parshas Vayechi. Wasn't Joseph of the greatest benefit to Egypt? He saved your lives. He never claimed to be Egyptian. Saved your lives. So Joseph was not Egyptian by nationality and Jewish by religion, right? But on the other hand, he was of eminent benefit to the state. So simply a person saying like this, I'm not really German, I'm not really British, I'm not really French, doesn't necessarily mean you're anti. However, at the end of the day, the Orthodox Jew is kind of fudging it. Let me explain. By Gentile secular definition, by the definition of secular Gentile nationalism, Jews were not members of a Jewish nationality. Such nationality does not exist. You understand? When the French gave, for example, the Jews, or the Italians later on gave the Jews citizenship, what they're saying in the law is, this is your citizenship, this is your nationality. Your Judaism, that's a religious business. You got Catholics, you got your Protestants, you got your Jews. But your national identity is French or German or English or whatever it was, or Dutch or anything. Then that means that what the state is saying is, you're not the member of another nation. There is no other nation. There is no such thing as a Jewish nation. Definition of Jewish is religious. You don't realize how significant it is to us in the United States of America, for example. The reason that there have always been civil rights for the Jews in this country, and hasn't even been an attempt to tamper with it, is because ever since George Washington, the Jews are defined as a religion. And under the Constitution of the United States, the Congress shall not make laws having to do with establishment of religion. Separation of church and state, as it's called colloquially. And as a result, since the Jews were regarded as a religious group, they couldn't be discriminated against. Now, had the Jews, for example, been regarded as a nationality, there's nothing in the Constitution prevent discrimination against members of another nation. After all, for example, only an American can vote. Only an American can be, a born American citizen can be president of the United States, for example. Wasn't that the whole fight with Obama? Racial, if Jews are defined as a race, as came later on in the 19th century, I don't have to tell you, the United States Constitution did not protect people of other non-white race. So it's all based on the idea that the Jews are not a nationality or anything else, they're just a religion. So is that true? If the Jews were members of a Jewish nationality, they would not be citizens of a secular state. Let me tell you something. Let's go to the next slide. The official position of the PLO, ever since their charter in the early 60s, this is what they write in there. Israel doesn't have a right to exist, an illegitimate state, because the Jews are not a nation. The Jews are just a religion, right? And if just a religious group is not entitled to a state. A nation is entitled to a national state. A religious group is not entitled to a national state. And so Arafat and Abu Mazen and all this junk, they'll go around telling you all the time, says, despite what you say, you're not a nation. They're just a religion. And therefore you can live in other countries and, be entitled to religious freedom or something like that. But you don't have the right to a state. Therefore, Israel does not have the right to exist. Now, on the other hand, by religious internal definition, in other words, by halachic definition, by the definition of the Torah, the Jews certainly are a national group. Now, in the history of Europe, it didn't matter too much. It has not been difficult for Orthodox Jews to fudge it, particularly in English-speaking countries. In the Middle East, I would say this has occasionally produced some strange and piquant scenes. Let's go to the next one. For example, Ovadia Yosef, some of you will recall, happened to be the rabbi in Egypt, almost the chief rabbi in Egypt. In 1948, in the middle of the war between Israel and Egypt, the independence war of Israel, when the Egyptian army invaded Palestine and fought the Jews like crazy. But he was in Egypt, and he was expected to, and he did do so. The king was there, King Farouk, and he said, I want you to make a prayer that the Egyptian army should win. And so here you have I mean, a frum guy doesn't cross his fingers. I don't know what Ovadia Yosef did. But it'd be an interesting situation. What was it like when he says, "Oh Lord, help the Egyptian army defeat the Israeli army in 1948?" You see, because the Egyptians were saying, "You're Egyptian by nationality, you're only Jewish by religion. Therefore, you should be against a Jewish state." Isn't life funny that way? The rise of the Zionist movement complicated matters immensely. It posited something new, or at least something that seemed to be new: a Jewish secular national identity. That's Theodor Herzl. Now, Theodor Herzl was atheist. In other words, a modern secular person, post-religious. So forget God and forget the Bible. None of that happened. Okay, fine. But the Jews are our people. Really? That's interesting. On what basis? You get what I'm saying? On what basis? In spite of what I just said, this is the basic idea behind the Zionist movement. It was a secular Jewish movement. When the Zionist Congress, they had delegates as they try to portray it from all over the world, from all different Jewish communities, saying that we're Jewish by secular nationality. Never was such a thing in history before. Now, the Zionists, even in Herzl's time, came in two flavors, as we see in the next one. You had your secular Zionists, you had your religious Zionists. As we know, the religious Zionists have been part of the Zionist movement since day one. Now, to religious Zionists, go to the next slide. The national identity they had was the traditional Jewish identity. He asked Rav Kook, Rav Herzog, or people like that, "Are you Jewish nationalists?" Definitely. You want a Jewish state? Definitely. Define a Jewish state. Am Hashem, Am HaNivchar, Har Sinai. The Torah. So in other words, their idea, their definition, the Mizrahi people, of a Jewish nationalism is what we would call a frum one. But if you do not believe in the existence of God, then what exactly is the Jewish nation? And more importantly, why should it be reconstituted in a nation state? Go to the next one. This is the question that the Ben-Gurion and the others, I don't know if they thought about it much, which is interesting. They just went ahead and did it. But if you are post-religious, you don't believe in God, you don't believe in the Bible really, why should the Jews reconstitute themselves as a state? Why not just blend in and disappear? To answer this question of questions, all kinds of theories were thought of, all which are resting on a secular no-God definition. Let's go to the next one. I mean, that's what Echad Ha'am was all about, when he posited European theories of nationalism, that the Jews are no worse than the British, the French, the Italians, and the others. Therefore, their national identity deserves expression. Or on the right, you have Mordechai Kaplan, who tried to give a religious pinch on it. There is no God in the traditional sense, but Judaism as what he called a civilization. These are all, twisting like pretzels to come up with a reason that there should be a Jewish state when the Jews, as a national category, in a secular sense, never existed before the Zionist movement. Now, within the Zionist movement itself, both religious Zionists and secular Zionists agreed to emphasize what was common among them, meaning that Jews are a nation, and to de-emphasize what was different among them. Are you believe in Jews as a nation chosen by God, or something else? That's within Zionist movement. But other Jewish groups did not agree. Indeed, they strongly disagreed and criticized the Zionists for defining Jews as a separate national group in modern secular terms. One set of critics attacked from the left. This would be, for example, Reform Judaism. Oh my goodness, 100 years ago, Reform movement, for the most part, was so anti-Zionist. They were so turned off by the notion that the Jews would be considered a nation. We're just a religion. We're Americans. We're Germans. We're just a different religion. Chas v'chalila, there should be any national component to Judaism. The Marxists, the socialists, twisted like pretzels to try to define the Jews. Karl Marx, Lenin, Stalin, Brunebauer, all these theoreticians, they wrote endlessly. I don't know if you're interested in this subject. What exactly are the Jews? Is it an economic group? Is it a leftover historical group? Is it a religious thing? In which case, the heck with them. In Eastern Europe, you saw a lot of Jews. Are they a national group? Stalin said, no, they're not. They don't have the characteristics of land and the common tongue. The Bundes said, oh, yes, we all talk Yiddish. They got in those kind of, twisted debates. The other set of critics came from the right, from the Haredim, the thoughtful Haredi. They rejected the notion of a secular Jewish nation because it's atheist. To them, there's no point of talking about a Jewish nation unless you're talking about Har Sinai, the Avos, Am Segula, and God revealing himself to the Jewish people and guiding them. And the entire Jewish historical experience has to be refracted through that lens. Otherwise, there's nothing to talk about. But the Haredim, let's put it this way, agreed with the religious Zionists on the definition of Jewish statehood, but they strongly criticized the religious Zionists for getting in bed with the secular Zionists, whose definition of Jewish statehood was so objectionable. Now, to be real, this is hair-splitting for most people. The average Jew, I bet you many of you watching right now are saying, what is he talking about? This was particularly true after Israel became a state in 1948, and it became clear that in spite of all the inflammatory Haredi predictions and rhetoric, Ben-Gurion was not going to turn out to be the monster that they had feared. My goodness, you read what they wrote in the 20s and the 30s and all this, and the Zionists are going to be worse than Hitler. Ron Cutler said in 1935 they will not let a single from Jew into Israel. None of this turned out to be true. Adrabah, not only was the state not going to close down yeshivas and so forth, but the way things evolved, the state of Israel actually ended up subsidizing the Haredi schools. I've talked about this many times, but I won't repeat myself. Let's go to the next one. The Aguda was part of Ben-Gurion's government, as you see over here, in the first years of the state, and even afterwards in an indirect fashion. And they did this in return for favors. And I'll tell you right now, there was no attempt by the Israeli government, listen closely to what I'm about to say, to touch the Aguda, to hurt the Haredim, the Ashkenazic, Eastern European, and Central European Jews who had come to Israel, were coming to Israel, and living within these, I'll call them black hat, that's not the right word to use for 1948, black hat frameworks. They didn't try to un-Hasidicize the Hasidim and un-Litvicize the Litvaks. They did that to the Sephardim, but not to the Haredim. Now, it's true that in the Ben-Gurion and other governments, the Jewish schools were perhaps underfunded. Underfunding is very different from suppressing yeshivas. Okay? And indeed, from 1948 on, there was a constant growth in new schools. Yeshiva Gedol, Yeshiva Katanas, the Chinuch Atzmai, the Tashbar, this group, that group, Beis Yaakov movement. There's a constant growth. As we know, the Haredim split over the ideological question of whether or not to participate in the state. I repeat, to participate in the state, not to participate in Zionism. It was never up for discussion among the Haredim, the Zionism is treif. But the state is a metzius, it's a reality. Is it okay to participate in the state? Let's do the next one. As you see, here you have the Haredi ideological split over partition. It was a right wing and a left wing. The right wing is in the Torah Karta. That's the Satmar Rebbe on the right side and Rabbi Amram Blau on the left side, the leader of the Torah Karta. Listen closely to what I said. That's the right wing. The left wing held that it's okay to participate in the state. Now I'm going to show you who the left wing is. Right? It's the Chazon Ish, it's the Ron Cutler. This is your left wing. That's the Ger Rebbe on the side, the Panovich Rav, and so forth. So within the Haredi world, that's already considered extreme leftism, because they said you should vote to participate in the government depending on circumstances. Now, really, this was splitting hairs if you're not an insider. True, the secular government and the Haredim had very different views of reality, including whether or not the God of the Torah exists, and whether or not the Jews are a secular nationality or an Am Segula. But so what? A pragmatic leadership on both sides focused on finding a modus vivendi, which actually involved concessions on the part of the seculars to the Orthodox. That's the Ben-Gurion era. I repeat, the modus vivendi involved the secular giving in on certain areas to the Haredim, and the religious Zionists. In the case of religious Zionists, it involved concessions on blue laws, keeping stores closed on Shabbos, can't sell treif meat and things like that. And of course, the personal status, which is still around today. Let's go to the next one. And so, the religious coercive democracy of Israel. Israel still is a country in 2020, about to enter 2021, despite many predictions over the years. It still is in the hands of the Orthodox rabbinate, the three major institutions of Kiddushin. You can't get married in Israel legally if it's not performed by an Orthodox rabbi, and he won't do it if you're going in a grusha, for example. Gittin, you can't get divorced unless you have a get, Kedasu Kedin, despite the fact that the husband might be a jerk and this and that and the other. There's no civil divorce in Israel, still in 2020 and 2021. And Gerus, according to the laws of Israel, it still is defined a Jew because the laws in the Chok HaShvut in Israel says anyone who's Jewish can come to Israel and become an instant citizen. I'm sure you may have seen today, I imagine, Jonathan Pollard landing in Israel. I spoke about him a couple weeks ago in a surreal way because we live in times of frenzied technological development. Pollard and his wife arrived today in Israel. He's instant citizen. He didn't have to wait 5 years like he would in America. That's because Jonathan Pollard and his wife are halakhically Jewish. As a Jewish mother. Okay? What about somebody else? Well, it's up to Rabbanut. Now, I know there are controversy and rage over this. That's not the point. It's still the law. Who made that law? Ben-Gurion and the other guys after him. Were they religious? No, they were secular. Actually, didn't believe in God. But they were willing to make these concessions in order to have the support of these parties in the government, to have social peace in society, and things of that nature. Now, for the Haredim, the concessions that were given to them, that they required, I'm talking about Ben-Gurion now, was draft exemption for boys and girls. Do you hear what I said? Draft exemption for boys and girls, which the Haredim got for Ashkenazi boys and Ashkenazi girls. In other words, even in the 50s, if you were a Beis Yaakov girl, as we would say today, and you went through the Beis Yaakov system, when you got to be 18, the army didn't go after you. Now, if you're Sephardic, it's a different story. You see, they put them in a separate category, and they went after them. Gave them a lot of trouble. If you're Ashkenaz and so forth, no. And a boy, if he goes through the system, you go to a Haredi school, and then a Haredi high school, Yeshiva Katana, then you go to Yeshiva Gedola, the Maisa, the army gave you the exemption. That's of gigantic importance for the future developments that we're going to talk about today. All this was the result of a Haredi leadership whose basic policy contained two interesting features. Let's take a look at the next slide. And this is Rabbi Aaron Kotler and Aponovich Rub and all the others, the left-wingers. What was the two features? What were the two features? Number one, a principled ideological rejection of the legitimacy of the state of Israel, its laws and institutions. Do you hear what I just said? From a frum perspective, there is no state of Israel. Not from a Haredi perspective. They have no right. They're not frum, therefore they don't have a right to exist. They're here, so we understand. Their laws, we don't really have to listen to. We just do. Their institutions are not really worthy of respect. I mean, ask the Panovich, well, what do you think of the Israeli Supreme Court, for example, something like that, you know? Not really. And the Knesset, I mean, they know it's there, but ideologically, in terms of principle, they don't give it the slightest bit of legitimacy. But at the same time, number two, a practical and pragmatic willingness to obey those laws and institutions and to support the Israeli government in its basic policies. As I told you before, Lamaisa, the Aguda, for example, was a reliable supporter of Ben-Gurion and Eshkol all during those first years of the state. It's just interesting, okay? So since they talked one way and walked another way, as I would put it today, from a practical day-to-day point of view, it's a viable situation, especially because the Haredim were so numerically small, and there were no threat to take over the country. But it's weird. It's weird to say I'm in a country that I don't recognize its right to exist. Now, really, most people say like this: who cares about these things that Rabbi Katz is bringing up tonight in terms of hair-splitting principles? It works. Interestingly, it was Ben-Gurion himself who saw the problems with this road. He said, this is not going to work down the road. Can't have a growing part of the population that doesn't recognize the country. You don't have this hardly anywhere else in members of the same ethnicity. In some countries, you have one ethnic group dominating another one, and the dominated ones say, we reject the legitimacy of the dominating country. I get that. But here, members of the same group, right, all Jewish. And so, in other words, if you told me an Arab today, I'm just making this up, in Israel, said, I don't really recognize the right of Israel to exist. I get their point of view, and I understand what they're saying. I don't agree with it, but I hear what they're coming from. This is a religious Jew. Now, Ben-Gurion had this problem, and that's why Ben-Gurion in 1954 went to see the Chazon Ish in the next slide. Right? And listen closely. When he met the Chazon Ish, Ben-Gurion sought a dialogue, hoping to elicit concessions in the manner of true dialogue. This is like Martin Buber. If you and I have a genuine conversation, a dialogue, it presupposes a whole bunch of things. If you and I have a dialogue, it means like this. We're different, but I respect your right to your position. You respect my right to my position. If we can argue civilly and you prove the cogency of certain points, I should accept that, and vice versa. Dialogue is a give and take. Now, the Chazon Ish would not conduct that type of dialogue. In his opinion, genuine dialogue was impossible. We're right, you're totally wrong. That's it. I repeat, pragmatically, the Chazon Ish didn't say, I guess, fight the country. But at the hashkafa level, if I can use that, in his famous, he famously restated forcefully the Haredi position, which he said, you're an empty ship and we're a full ship, using a famous parable in the Gemara. Right? And Ben-Gurion said, we're an empty ship? And he said, yeah. So in other words, it's a funny situation. Without doing the slightest thing violent, and without disobeying any laws, he simply said, I do not recognize the legitimacy of who you are and what you represent. Although, since we live here and pragmatically, we'll go along with and participate in the process. So, I repeat, Ben-Gurion wanted to start a dialogue. Chazon Ish would not do that. Ben-Gurion gave up and settled for the pragmatic thing, but he was always bothered by the ideological thing. Right? And it is strange and not healthy from a national perspective to have a large and growing population in a country which doesn't recognize the legitimacy of the country, which is the situation you have in Israel today. Now, for their part, the Haredi leaders concentrated on sectoral matters, as they call them, migzar, building chinuch, dealing with problems that popped up from time to time on an ad hoc basis. I remember when I was a kid, there used to be autopsies, right? The hospitals were doing autopsies on from Jews. Oh, all hell was raised. Properly so. That's a local, specific issue. You understand? Directly impacts it. It's not a large issue. The only big internal controversy in the Haredi world I can think of had to do with what they call PI, the Poli Aguda. There used to be Aguda and Poli Aguda. Poli was the left-wing part of the Aguda, and they didn't always follow the directives of the Moetzes Gedolei Torah. So when the Aguda leadership, big rabbi, said, you shouldn't join the government, sometimes the Poli Aguda said, we should join the government. Then they did. That's the kind of inside baseball that constituted the internal dissension, strife within the Haredi community. It's not that big. Now, internally, the Haredim were institutionally concentrated in the Agudas Yisrael, in the Aguda, with its famous Moetzes Gedolei Torah, right? This council of supreme Torah sages, representing basically the two constituencies in the Aguda, the Hasidic and the non-Hasidic, or the Litvish. I'm going somewhere with this, so pay attention. Half the Moetzes Gedolei Torah, all these different Hasidic rabbis, the other half of these Lithuanian Rosh Hashivas were not Hasidic at all. There were no Sephardim in the Yiddish-speaking Moetzes Gedolei Torah. Now, this is a rather conservative body. They pursued a consensual style of politics, seeking consensus opinions in their group. You understand what I'm saying? So therefore, the only time the Moetzes Gedolei Torah would express themselves is when everybody on board, or almost everybody, was on the same page. Not so often. Meanwhile, as time went on, from 1948 to the 70s, both sectors of Israeli society grew and grew, secular and Haredi, in the same country, but in different neighborhoods and in different worlds. Politically, the Aguda appealed to about 3 to 4% of the voters in the state of Israel. That's why they always got like 3 or 4 votes. And since, thanks to their own self-denying ordinance, because after 1952 they said you can't join the government because of the drafting of the girls, mind you, okay? So, as a result of that, They couldn't be part of the government, okay? And therefore, they couldn't obtain ministries with the funding that goes along with the ministries, and they had no influence on national politics. They were a classic sectoral party, concentrating on their Dalai Lamas and on getting funding and whatever for their institutions. One more thing, the political culture of the Aguda was two-tiered. There was the big Rebbe for the Hasidic and big Rosh Hashivas who were in the Modus Torah who avoided the limelight, the secular limelight. They didn't give interviews to secular journalists usually, and they never spoke individually on questions of national politics outside the Moeses. The actual political day-to-day politics, the Tammany Hall politics and speech, was a function of a small cadre of politicos, professional politicos, the actual Knesset members and their Tammany Hall chevra, who were supposed to wallow in the political cesspool while carrying out the instructions of the rabbis in the Moeses Gedolei Torah, none of whose august members would condescend to ever appear in the Knesset, which is why you take it to the next one. Here are the two politicos. If you remember them, Porish and Lawrence, and they have some Hasidic guys. They're for the wheeling and dealing, the backroom maneuvers, all the dirty stuff of the politics. But they were doing it on behalf of their constituency. Let's go to the next one. Here's Menachem Begin talking with the religion. It's not the big rabbis. These are the Knesset members. These are politicos. That's Lawrence on the right side. That's Yehuda Bramwitz on the left side. You know what I mean? And you can see by how they're talking. They're talking hardcore politics. I'll give you this. You give me that. I'll take this. You take that. Okay? By the way, that's how politics runs. Now, all this began to change in the 1970s in a process which reached its climax in the 1980s and 1990s. There was an external reason for this, as well as an internal development. The external reason was Menachem Begin, the rise of the Likud, and the secular split between Likud and Labor. Okay? So in other words, as we all know, down till today, in 2020, 2021, Israel's going to have elections soon, it seems, like a fourth one. And it's the same split. Do you want to make a Palestinian state? You don't want to make a Palestinian state. You want to do this? You want to do that? It's a right wing. In other words, the secular political world is mama split down the middle very harshly. And that has always played good for the Aguda, for the Haredim. Because whenever they have elections, the secular parties are going to not unite together. You know what's going on right now. For example, just take one example. They hate Netanyahu. Isn't that right? All these breakaway parties. The blue and white, the pink and green, whatever you want to say, right? The orange and yellow. They all hate Netanyahu with a passion. I'm not saying they're wrong. I'm not saying they're right. I'm just saying you and I follow the politics more or less on a personal level. And therefore, they'd rather die than join in some kind of government with Netanyahu. Fine. So he says, Chabder and Bud, and I'll get a group together, and then I get all the Haredim on board. And then I get my 61. You understand? So they've been able to leverage this split, as we all know, ever since 1977, which is 45 years now. And that's one way they got power and influence. All Likud governments have depended totally on the Haredim. Menachem Begin, starting from day one, was totally willing for political reasons, and I would say also personal reasons, to do two things. Completely stop the pressure drafting of girls' gizbanos. I mean, he didn't abolish the women's branch of the Israeli army, but he made a policy where all a girl has to say is, I don't want to go, I'm religious, even if she walks in shorts, you know, and we're not going to give her any trouble. And that was good enough for the Haredim. No, that way, it's guaranteed there's zero pressure on anybody who wants to say they're from. Even though it obviously opens a big door for people who want to fake it. That's number one. And number two, Begin promised and carried out to stop the underfunding. As a matter of fact, he moved to overfunding. Right? And so the Shivas, the Kollels, the Beis Yaakov all started getting serious money for the first time ever in Jewish history. I repeat what I said, for the first time ever in Jewish history. Never been a situation in which, I would say, from institutions get big bucks. But in Israel it happens. And let's go to the next one. This has been the basis for the Likud holding power under the successors. These guys that you see in front of you have been Prime Minister of Israel in the majority of the last 45 years. It's Begin, it's Shamir, it's Sharon, it's Bibi. the labor has been sidelined for most of the time. And it's fundamentally due, if you break it down to the political nuts and bolts, it's the alliance between the Likud on the one hand and the Haredi parties on the other. That was the external reason for the change in relationship between the Haredim and the state. The internal reason was the emergence of a unique leader in the Haredi camp, at least in one part of the Haredi camp, in one part of the Haredi world, and this, of course, was Rav Shach. We go over here, right? Who, as you see, was born in 1898, which means when he started his political career, if it's the 1970s and 80s, here's someone who's older than the century, right? I mean, when he was talking to Begin, Rav Shach was from way back when. He was never involved in politics till his older age. A total Litvak, totally emerged in the Lithuanian yeshiva world. That's what he did all of his life, from the beginning of his life. He was born in Lithuania, 25 miles away from Panovich. He attended a Panovich yeshiva in 1909 when he was 10 years old. Okay? Shiva Katana. No, he was in Panovich before Panovich yeshiva existed, as we know it today. And then he went to Slobodka in 1913. He was in Slobodka time of the altar, before the First World War. And then during the First World War, when things were terrible in Lithuania, he wandered and moved here and there and learning all the time under terrible conditions, great privation, starvation, no clothes. You hear what I said? No clothes. Tattered thing, no haircut. Living a life of great misery and learning up a storm during the first years of World War I. You can read up, it's actually interesting. And then, later in the war, he moved to Slutsk in Belarus. And there he met Rav Zalman Meltzer. And he hooked up with him. And eventually married his niece. And so he had a hard time. And I'm skipping a lot of parts, but I just want to give you a basic framework of who we're talking about. Once he finished what you and I would call Kollel years, he started in the 1920s and 30s to look for a position as a Rosh Yeshiva, or a Maggid Shir, as we would say today, in the Eastern European yeshiva world without much success, right? Because there weren't that many positions. And usually in the Litvish yeshivas, the positions go for relatives. And it's true he was a nephew. He was married to the niece of Mr. Zalman. That wasn't good enough, That wasn't close enough. And so he was a Maggid Shir here, and a Rosh Yeshiva and a small yeshiva here and there and the others. Never quite worked out for what he wanted. He even tried out for Chachmei Lublin. When Meir Shapiro died, he's one of the candidates to be the Rosh Yeshiva Chachmei Lublin. At the same time, he was recognized as a star, and he was close with all the big rabbis, Chaim Grozensky, and all of that generation. So notice everybody said like this: he's got the caliber to be a big Rosh Yeshiva, but just haven't found the institutional position for him yet. He escaped to Palestine in 1941. It's most unusual. He got out just before Hitler invaded. He got a passport legally, him and his family. They made it from Lithuania to Moscow to Odessa. They took a ship in the Black Sea. It's all legal. They landed in Turkey, and they took a train from Turkey to Israel. It's just an interesting path. Very few people had that luck in the Holocaust. And again, once in Israel, he knocked about looking for a right job in the rather limited yeshiva world in the 1940s. It's notorious. He taught for a while in a religious Zionist school. Woo! They try to underplay that in the biographies. Finally, in 1952, it's noticed when he's 55 years old, he got the dream job in Panovich as one of the three biggies there. And that's the famous team that made the yeshiva famous. If you came to Panovich, they had the 3 stars. That's Rav Shmuel Gruzovsky on the left, David Povarsky on the right, and Rav Shach. They were the 3 Maggid Shirs, and they were all stars. And he was a natural in being a mechanech, getting together with boys. You know what I mean? In other words, he was good at that, and he was a great gaon. Therefore, he had the perfect situation, the dream job in Panovich. Look at this video over here for a second. I think you can see somebody took a picture. There's Rav Shach in a younger age, and there's a boy in the Panovich yeshiva in the 1950s. No black hats at that time. You can see the way he's talking to him, and the body language, all the rest of it. He knows how to deal with Bachrim. You know what I'm saying? That is what he did all of his life. That's what he lived for. And I think it's kind of cute. I could tell stories, but that's not my job tonight. For 2 decades, from 52 to 72, Rav Shach just taught. But after that, he began to get involved in Haredi politics, and he emerged as what I would call a conviction politician and not a consensus politician. So he was a Margaret Thatcher type, okay? In which you say, if you don't have enemies, you're not doing anything right. You have to take strong positions, stand forward boldly, calling your followers to follow your path. Don't worry about shaking the world up. That's what leadership means. Leadership means shaking things up and making things go in a certain direction and ruffling feathers, or you die without having ever gotten anything done. And then what was the point of being a leader? Okay? This is called conviction politician. Margaret Thatcher used to have a poem she quoted all the time. That would fit for Rav Shach. That was his personality. Now, you wouldn't have known it when he was a Maggid Shir and, Rashiv and all that, when he was just in an educational position. As he emerges in the last decades of his life, so he became a political leader in his late 70s, in his 80s, in his 90s. That's a very unusual profile in the world of politics. But that's who he was. And he obviously brought an old world point of view. Okay? Just to give you one example, it's very famous. This is cute. He said, I prefer Moshe and Aaron. Everybody knows, it's very famous, you've heard this, that when Aaron died, it said, Vayivku kol beis Yisrael. But when Moshe died, it just said, Vayivku beis Yisrael. When Aaron died, everybody cried. When Moshe died, some cried, some didn't. So usually the way you say it is like this. Aaron was a Rodef Shalom, true, and an Ohei Shalom, and he was a marriage counselor. Everybody loved Aaron, and when he died, the loss was felt by everybody. Moshe, on the other hand, made enemies. So some appreciate him, some didn't appreciate him. That's how it goes. Usually the way you spin it is you say, so you see, Aaron was better. But not Rav Shach. He said, no, Moshe was better. The fact that not everybody means Moshe took stands. He got things done. Aaron was just popular. You can make a golden calf that way. Moshe was the one who had to leave the hard thing and go forth to Israel. Don't go back. Don't listen to Korach. Don't bow down to idols. He had to make the hard stand. So Moshe was a leader who got the Jews from point A to point Z. So that involves ruffling feathers and making enemies. In Rav Shach's case, the controversies were ideological, because these are controversies I'm speaking about within the Haredi world. For example, in the 1970s, early in his career, he resigned from the Moesis Gedolei Torah in protest against the Ger Rebbe's attitude towards Poli Aguda. I told you before, that's the left wing of the Aguda movement. They didn't always listen to the Moesis Gedolei Torah. A lot of times they did not. They're very from Jews. This is Kibbutz Chavetz Chaim. They're very ultra-Orthodox Jews. But they had their own ideas in politics. If you're the Ger Rebbe, and Ger in general, they said, it was very heavily Ger Hasidim anyway. He said, listen, some people need it like that. Don't get under case. Try to be makar of them. Rav Shach said they should be ostracized, they'd be excommunicated. And when he couldn't get the council of Torah sages to vote his way, he quit. Okay? In the 1980s, he didn't hesitate to bitterly criticize Chabad for messianism. In other words, for heresy. Okay? And, he made a big deal out of all this. Everybody knows there was huge fights, huge enmity. When Rav Shach towards the Lubavitcher Rebbe, they said, is he turning himself into a Shabtai? No, he didn't mind inflammatory language. You understand? He goes to the next one. He's the one who said that Steinsal's a heretic. You can't read the Steinsal's. You understand? These are ideological positions which he did not hesitate to take. On the contrary. Was he anti-Hasidic? Was he, as some of his critics said, the last of the Bisnagdim? The last of the Vilna Gaons? Not really. Seriously, it's easy to make those not really. There are plenty of Hasidim in Panovich. He got along with, he liked the Hasidim, but he didn't like certain things. And he had no hesitation of blasting them and doing it in public so people should know what the proper hashkafa is as he sees it. He expected his followers to follow his hashkafa. Okay? Now the Hasidim can't get angry at this because that's what they do also. If you're a Lubavitch, you expect to follow the hashkafa of the Lubavitch Rebbe. You understand? This is how it goes. Now, Rav Shach played an active role in the Begin coalition negotiations once the Likud came to power, and he did not hesitate to lecture Menachem Begin on Land for Peace. Last year I showed you a letter they wrote Begin, unsolicited, in which he said, don't be so stubborn, and especially, as you see in the next slide, don't provoke Esau, the monster. Right? You have to know, as he said, he quoted Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva's like this, when I survived a storm at sea, because every time a wave came, I ducked under the wave. So that's the policy of the Jewish people throughout history. It's an argument, you can agree, disagree. It's an argument. I'm just saying, Chazon Ish wouldn't write a letter like that to Menachem Begin. The Panovich Rabban wouldn't like a letter like that. Cheskel Sarn is not writing a letter like that here. They're concentrating their sectoral matters. But Rav Shach is a day on everything. Now, by the way, Menachem Begin never asked his opinion. Right? Interestingly, Menachem Begin was not a chassid, but he did consult on national security issues with the Lubavitcher Rebbe. There's a famous thing when he came there and afterwards, because he considered the Lubavitcher Rebbe, not in his capacity as Hasidic Rebbe, but in the capacity of who the Lubavitcher Rebbe was, to have a lot of wisdom in national security matters. So we're dealing with someone, as I said before, who embraced partisan passion. By the 1980s, Rav Shach is presiding over a very interesting situation as far as the world of Lithuanian yeshivas is concerned. People like Rav Shach wanted to rebuild the world of Lithuanian yeshivas that had been wiped out by Hitler, right? And by Stalin. This was their life mission and their grand passion. That was the world that I grew up in. And it's totally understandable. Once upon a time, you had all these things over in Europe. Mir and Panovich and Slobodka and, Telz and, Kamenetz and so forth and so on. Radin, one after the other, all wiped out. Nebuch, all wiped out. Murdered. Our job is to do the best we can to revive that. Well, it's okay, but they over-succeeded. I don't mean literally they over-succeeded, but in other words, what they did was do a lot more than just replace what had been before. They created a new situation. In doing that, they created a new situation which far surpassed what had been before. Quite exceeded in the state of Israel what had once existed on many levels. First of all, quantitatively, there were a relatively limited number of, you start counting up, back in Europe in the 1930s, let's say, for example, how many guys were in Slobodka, how many guys were in Telz, how many guys were in Branovich, and so on and so forth. You're not going to end up with large numbers, okay? A few thousand. They come to Israel by the 50s, by the 60s. Kanena horror, there's thousands and thousands. And the 70s and 80s, 90s, many, many more. Okay? So the quantity vastly increased. Second of all, in Europe, back in Eastern Europe, there's very small kollel. Most people didn't have the money for it. After you're married, start have a family, you look for a job somewhere. In chinuch, in whatever area. But there aren't long-term kollels. In Israel, it's a life proposition, as we know. By the time Rav Shach came along, by the time you get to the 70s and after Begin, it's totally possible, and many people do. They say this is what they want to sit and learn all their life. Shift. Literally. Right? And you can do it because you get the government subsidies to pay for it. For the first time, unlike Lithuania and Eastern Europe, you had government money in the millions. You had Beis Yaakov salaries. None of this existed. You understand? People have to realize, you talk about the yeshiva world in the old country, it's tremendous poverty. I mean, really poverty. And sometimes hunger. In Israel, Kanena Hara is the opposite. Especially, even in the previous times. Once the state of Israel came along, there's not hunger anymore. And particularly after Begin. Okay? And finally, this to me the cutest part. You got to remember something. You look at the photographs, you think everybody in Europe was from Jew. Most people were not Jewish. You go to those cities that we talked about of yesteryear, Panovich, Mir, Vilna, Kovna, Warsaw, you name it. I've been in many of them. The vast majority of the population was Catholic, was Christian. Nothing wrong with that. That was that part of the world. It was Lithuania, Belarus, Poland, Ukraine, all that stuff. Most of the people you came across, not Jewish. Most of the buildings, churches. You go there today, you see it. Yes, they also had synagogues. And they might have a yeshiva or something like that also. That is true. But the whole gang wasn't like that. You understand? You come to Israel, and they rebuild in Jerusalem, Bnei Brak, and such places, and they're Gentiles. They're no churches. Everybody's Jewish. If you live in the right place, everybody's a Shomer Shabbos. Where did you have that? Okay? Everybody? Now, by the way, that's a sign of what you call perception. I have to tell you, I grew up in Forest Park. And when I was growing up, all I saw was synagogues. I come back now, I said, boy, there was churches all over the place. I mean, they were in my peripheral vision when I was a kid. But you didn't notice it so much. So there may be how it was in Europe, I don't know. But in Israel, it's objective reality. There's nothing going on, as you know, in Bnei Brak. Nothing going on in Geula and such places. Now, anyway, Kiryat Sefer, what are the other cities called? You know what I mean? Modi'in and so forth. Now, this is created, and by the way, that means if you're growing up in Lithuania or Poland or one of those places, there are many other forces out there to grab your attention. If you're growing up in Israel, all you have is the firm stuff all around you. And finally, in the time of Rav Shach and afterwards, there's no ideological Yetzer Hara anymore. Zionism, dead. Socialism, dead. Communism, dead. What do I mean Zionism, dead? Zionism was around the head of state of Israel, but the ideology, the pioneering and all that is all gone. Everybody knows that. Right? So basically, the only militant, strong ideology out there, people living their lives of passion, is your Orthodox, and especially ultra-Orthodox. I don't think Rav Shach and company quite foresaw the new Yetzer Hara that would not be, meaning that we have today in the 21st century, which would not be a competing ideology, but rather consumerism, which has a different appeal. But I'm not going to go into that tonight. The growth of the Lithuanian yeshiva population in quantity and quality was such, in Israel I'm talking about, that this population was already an entire sector of Israeli society, with its own narrow, with its own Gucci needs, requiring its own Gucci ideology and institutions beyond the physical yeshivas and schools themselves. And Rav Shach was the only leader in this population with the charisma, the personality, and the desire to exercise strong and clear ideological as well as practical guidance on a very wide range of contemporary issues. Quite a statement. I'll just give you one. I told you before, right wing and left wing. The Torah card says don't vote. You vote for Israel, you vote in the Israeli elections, you're participating in Zionism. It's like Yahar Gval Yavar. They really say that. Rav Shach said, I guess, don't listen to any of that. It's baloney. We need to get everybody out there to vote to get a maximum number of seats in the Knesset so we can get more money and more support for our institutions. And as you know, the whole world listened to him. Okay? Now, since this was a narrowly designed set of policies for a narrow sector of society, even the Hasidic culture and ideology was not a perfect fit for Rav Shach's needs. As I indicated before, he strongly disagreed with the Ger Rebbe and some other Hasidic groups on different things. I mean, by the way, when he said Steinsalz was treif, the Ger Rebbe said Steinsalz is kosher. So he was right. Right? Accordingly, at the height of Haredi success, in the midst of Begin's second government, actually Shamir took over, leaving the government vulnerable to firm pressure, Rav Shach came to the unthinkable conclusion that the Aguda party no longer serves the needs of the Lithuanian yeshiva sector as they needed to be served, as they deserved to be served, and that the Lithuanian yeshivas should dump the Aguda. In other words, they should secede from the Aguda and find some other political instrument to serve its needs efficiently. Now that's a shock. This is unthinkable, as given its long history, the Aguda brand was the from Britain. It still is in America. I mean, you think of the Aguda, it was Kodesh. The Chavetz Chaim was at the Aguda convention. I mean, what do you want? Ron Cutler. The Aguda is identical with from, not Rav Shach. Not Rav Shach. Okay? It wasn't unthinkable to him. I told you, he's a bold leader. And in the 1980s, he had followers. The Lithuanian yeshivas followed him. He was a manhig. Okay? Thinking politically, Rav Shach had to worry whether a Lithuanian yeshiva party, if it seceded from the Aguda, would get enough votes even to get one seat in the parliament. It's a fair question. And so Rav Shach came up with a bold plan out of left field, maybe I should say right field, a plan to garner a large vote. Sephardim. There are lots of potential Sephardi voters out there. Israel loaded with Sephardim. And from his point of view, naturally, their votes always went to junk parties. The Mizrahi, the Likud, these little jokes like Tami and whatever, it's a total waste. After all, he said, the The Sephardim are basically frum. I mean, maybe they're not observant, but they're certainly traditional, and deep down they're Haredi whether they realize it or not. Okay, now our story, my friends, becomes dramatic and politically pilpulistic. Are you ready? Here we go. In the Ben-Gurion era, the Sephardim were objects of Mapai de-religionizing efforts. This is the notorious facts of Israeli history. In reaction, back in those years, the Lithuanian yeshiva movement sought to rescue as many Sephardim as they could, and therefore they had to educate them in Litvish schools. So they took girls and tried to put them in Beis Yaakovs. They took boys of promise and tried to put them in the Lithuanian yeshivas, figuring that they were preventing them from becoming, God forbid, Zionist and secular. That is one dynamic, which saw the entry of some Sephardic kids into Lithuanian yeshiva institutions. But the counter dynamic was the classic Ashkenazic racism. One is familiar to us from my lectures on the Ethiopians, a racism which is alive and well today. Now, I'm going to show you a clip, 4 minutes, from a movie that they made last year or 2 years ago, whatever, in Israel. Shuli Rand, remember Mr. Ushpizin? He made a movie about the very beginnings of the Shas party, long before it got to the national level. I'll talk about that a little bit later. And he's showing you something happened very often, which is, you'll see in a second. There's a father, has a daughter, he's a Sephardi, and there's a daughter in Beis Yaakov, an Ashkenazi school. And they're kicking her out, and it turns out they're kicking her out for the wrong reasons. They thought she was someone else, and they heard rumors about her which turned out to not be true, but rather than back down and say, we're sorry, they basically said, Lo matim, she doesn't fit with us. And when he says why, they use the language of, what should I say, velvet gloves racism, which makes him angry. Take a look yourself.
אנשים חושבים שהם יודעים מה זה פוליטיקה, אבל הם לא. היום תגיד ש"ס לאנשים, ישר הם חושבים עצרות, בנייני האומה, שלטים בכל הארץ, ישר הם חושבים דרעי, חושבים ארן או אלי ישי. אבל זה לא האמת. לפעמים הקדוש ברוך הוא שם רעיונות גדולים אצל אנשים קטנים. ובתכלס, כל מפלגה מתחילה ברגע אחד של מישהו שנמאס לו ומחליט לשנות. זה היה 60 יום הבחירות, ואני הייתי אז בן 47. וחצי. אני רוצה לדעת, איפה המורה של הילדה שלי?
מי זאת המורה שלה?
מי זאת המורה שלך?
גברת רוזנצוויג.
גברת רוזנצוויג, איפה היא?
י' 2.
איפה זה? בואי. את גברת רוזנצוויג?
כן.
יכולה להסביר לי למה עשית את זה? הייתה איתה איזו בעיה מיוחדת, התפרצה בכיתה, דיברה בשיעור, העתיקה במבחן משהו? את בכלל יודעת למה זה קרה?
לא, אני לא יודעת.
אז מי יודע?
אולי רכזת השכבה, גברת נויברט.
נויברט. את נויברט?
כן.
אז אולי את יכולה להסביר לי למה זרקו את הבת שלי בפעם השנייה תוך שבועיים.
גברת אסתי ממן היקרה שלך נראתה ביום שישי בערב בחברת 3 בחורים מישיבת אור תורה.
לא קוראים לי אסתי ממן, קוראים לי חלי כהן. אסתי ממן עם מיעוט 3.
גברת כהן.
אני דורש לדבר עם המנהלת.
גברת בלומיטה לא יכולה עכשיו, היא בפגישה חשובה.
פגישה חשובה, בוא נראה.
גברת כהן, אנא ממך, אתה תיכנס, אבל תן לנו 5 דקות לפני לעדכן אותה.
5 דקות התחילו. כן.
מר כהן, אני מבינה שאתה נסער מזה שהבת שלך לא רשומה יותר בבית יעקב.
אז זה לא רשומה יותר, זה מילים יפות, לאהבתם אותה.
אין לכל דבר סיבה אצלנו, מר כהן.
בואי נשמע.
הבת שלך נמצאה לא מתאימה לערכים של בית יעקב.
למה?
נודע לנו ממקור מוסמך שיש לכם טלוויזיה בבית?
זה שטות, לנו יש טלוויזיה בבית. אני בן תורה מבטן ומלידה, לא הייתה לי טלוויזיה ולא תהיה לי טלוויזיה. הלאה.
ועוד נודע לנו ממקור מוסמך שהבת שלך נוהגת להסתובב עם שסע וחצאי ג'ינס, ולפעמים אחרי הלימודים אפילו בלי גרביים.
אולי תבדקי את המקור המוסמך שלך. את רוצה לבוא עכשיו אליי הביתה לבדוק חצאית אם יש בכלל דבר כזה?
לא.
נו, אז אני עוד לא שמעתי סיבה טובה, גברת מנהלת.
הבת שלך לא מתאימה לכאן. זה פשוט עניין של התאמה.
מה זה עניין של התאמה? רגע, ציונים טובים יש לה, נכון? ברוך השם, מה את אמרת לי? אז מה, היא עשתה משהו או לא עשתה משהו?
שמע, אני רוצה לספר לך סיפור. כשאני הייתי צעירה, אני מאוד רציתי להתחתן עם בחור כלשהו, תלמיד חכם. הייתי מאוד רגשנית, אני מודה. אבל כשבאתי לאימא שלי, היא אמרה לי, גברת בלומנטל, הוא לא מתאים לך. זה רק עניין של התאמה. לפעמים לא מוצאים את הדבר הספציפי שלא מתאים, זה פשוט לא שייך.
לא שייך.
לא שייך. אכן, מר כהן, הבת שלך לא שייכת לכאן.
תקשיבי לי טוב, רבקה. או שאת מחזירה אותה עכשיו לפה לאלתר, או שאני מבטיח לך שאת תצטערי על זה.
מר כהן, החברה החרדית הסכימה לארח אתכם כאן. אל תבגדו בהכנסת האורחים שלה. יהיה לזה מחיר.
אני אגיד לך למה את זרקת אותה, רק בגלל סיבה אחת. בגלל שהיא ספרדיה, בגלל שהיא פרנקית. אז אני מבטיח לך. את עוד תביני טוב מאוד איזה מין ספרדי זה יעקב כהן.
I think that speaks for itself, right? And by the way, this still goes on. This is a movie that I think came out a year ago, 2 years ago. In Hebrew, I think it's called Bilti Rishmim, if I'm not mistaken. When I saw the English title years ago, it was called Unorthodox. Then that title got taken over by something else. And we'll leave that alone. Now, it's all about how they founded the original Shas party. It's a very cynical picture because it's the truth. Now, in reaction, out of a natural desire to end Ashkenazi Haredi patronizing like Tammany Hall, variations of what we just saw, a handful of young Sephardim, including this guy, started the Shas party to run in the local municipal elections in Yerushalayim on a local ward politics. That means they're running against the Aguda. Do you hear what I said? They're running in Frum neighborhoods in Yerushalayim for the Frum vote, the Haredi vote, against the Aguda, because they're competing for the same votes. And they were successful. That's the funny part. They were able to rally the Sephardim on an ethnic basis, and we've been pushed around long enough, and this and that and the other, and fine. Rav Shach noticed this, and he gave him an idea. Shas, which is what these guys called themselves, was a small, genuinely Frum party, intent on a bigger slice of the municipal taksivim in Jerusalem. It had garnered voter support. It appealed to Sephardim, but it wasn't like Tommy or one of these other junk parties, okay? It was a genuinely religious party. In this movie you just saw, like it was a Frum guy. I would say he's a Haredi. If the party would agree to be led by his hand-picked Sephardim, that is Sephardi B'nai Torah, who would agree to be guided by Rav Shach's Das Torah, notice his guidance in politics, as all B'nai Torah in the Lithuanian Yeshiva world would agree to be guided in those years, then he, Rav Shach, might create a political party that could win votes, possibly many votes, enough to win many seats in the Knesset. This would not be a party like the Aguda, where the Hasidim have such a powerful influence and often the final say, where the Hasidim certainly did not feel bound to follow the Das Torah of Rav Shach. These are Hasidic rabbis. They got their own opinions. Thank you very much. Rather, the new party would be Rav Shach's party, guided by his Das Torah. Granted, it would be strange that Sephardic voters would be empowering a Lithuanian rabbi, a Litvish Gadol, but his Das Torah would be the best guide for all Jews, whether they realize it or not. And so it was that this small group of Sephardim from the municipal elections in Jerusalem allowed themselves to be supplanted by people handpicked by Rav Shach, like Rabbi Yitzchak Peretz, as you see in the next slide, right? Who was a graduate of Chevron Yeshiva. In other words, he's an insider. Now he's born in Casablanca. He's Moroccan. He's Sephardic. but he's educated in a classic Litvish yeshiva in Hebron. So notice he's a Litvak by identity and therefore a follower of Shach's Das Torah. And so when it was announced that a new Sephardi party was being formed to run in the 1984 Knesset elections, it was advertised as being under the patronage of and subject to the Das Torah of Rav Shach, who was not Sephardi. This is just interesting. In addition, he's a remarkable leader. He said like this: you got the Aguda, which we don't like, he said. We got this new party. The Aguda says it's got a Moetzes Gedolei Torah. The Sephardim need one too. Why don't you take the Sephardim one to the regular Moetzes Gedolei Torah? Nah, let's do separate but equal, like they used to have in America. And so Rav Shach set up a Sephardic version of the Moetzes Gedolei Torah, which he called the Moetzes Chachmei Torah. You know what I'm saying? Go to the next one. They'll be the Gedolim, so to speak, for the Sephardim, and they'll listen to me. They'll listen to me. Okay? So it's kind of very interesting. It's more like a separate but equal situation. And it's not really equal. Remember, Rav Shach himself by this time had seceded from the Moetzes Gedolei Torah because of the Hasidim, but he did not need any formal body to institutionalize his own charisma. He didn't need a Moetzes Gedolei Torah. This is an interesting phenomenon. Let's go to the next one. If you go back 100 years, literally, you'll find that the Aguda Party, when it was started, which is just before the First World War, set up something called the Moetzes Gedolei Torah, the Council of Torah Sages, which was supposed to be an attempt to counter the Zionist movement, which had a World Zionist Congress and all that. Elected leaders here, instead of elected leaders, you have the big Rabbonim. But that's an interesting statement. Moetzes Gedolei Torah means it's a council of Gedolei Torah. Who decides that? Well, what makes somebody Gadol? I mean, do you have a card? Now they're saying you actually do. There's a formal body. If you remember when you're a Gadol, after all, you got a card. This provoked a lot of opposition back in the interwar period. On the left-hand side, you see Moshe Soloveitchik, the father of J.B. Soloveitchik. Where Moshe Soloveitchik was the son of Chaim Brisker, right? And he was strong. He said, what Moetzes Gedolei Torah? I don't have to listen to them. Who called them Gedolim? I may know how to learn a lot better than this member or that member, which is true. And so where do you get the chutzpah to try to recreate some kind of Sanhedrin just on your own, based on partisan politics? And he had a bitter correspondence with Chaim Moshe Grudzinski, who was the backer of the Aguda and one of the creators of Moetzes Gedolei Torah. So these are all insider baseball for within the world of the Gedolei Torah, right? And he's raising fascinating questions about what's a Gadol. Let's go to the next one. The original meaning in the history of the Aguda was they try to get what we would say today leading rabbinical figures of different constituencies. Take a look at this in the first paragraph. In Katowice, that's before the First World War, who was on the original Moetzes Gedolei Torah? Well, you got the Ger Rebbe, you got the Lubavitcher Rebbe. All right, I get that. Those are large constituencies. You got the big Litvaks of Chaim Brisker, Bitzigai Zalevi. He was the founder of the Aguda, historian. Rameir Simcha Dvin, that's the Or Sameach, of Chaim Moshe Grudzinski, Rabitzel Panovitcher. Okay. That's not the totality of all the big rabbis in Lithuania, but okay. Then you had Rabbi Breuer from Frankfurt. See the biggest Talmud Chacham in Germany? It's arguable, but he represented the Aguda section in the Frankfurt, so that's a constituency thing. Rabbi Feichenfeld opposed it. I don't think anybody's heard of him. The W.C. Hoffman. So Rabbi Breuer represented the Hirschians, and W.C. Hoffman represented the Hildesheimer ones. You see what I'm saying? It's like a politics, right? And Rabbi Reich from Budapest, who probably didn't represent anybody in Hungary, because Hungary didn't win it to you good at all. What about after the First World War? The second one. Chavetz Chaim, okay. The Ger Rebbe, okay. Chartkov Rebbe, Chaim Meiser, Rameir Arik, he was a giant Talmud, okay. Morgenstern, the Sokolov Rebbe, I don't know. Radzina Rebbe, Rameir Domplotsky, okay, the Kli Chemda. Moshe Mordechai Epstein, that's the Rosh Yeshiva of Slobodka. Meir Shapiro, you've heard of him. Rabbi Steinberg abroad, the big posek. Rabbi Weber of Pistiani. And Rabbi Breuer. You see what I'm saying? No, it's not so simple. This doesn't constitute the totality of all the Gedolim, right? And it represents kind of a mixture between people who are leading rabbis and also geographic constituencies. For example, there's nobody there from the United States of America. Just to give one example. Of course, there was no good constituency at that time. Nobody there from Western Europe. By that I mean France, England, those kind of places. You see what I'm getting at. Now, this raises a discussion. I could put an hour into this, but I'm not going to. Don't worry. Does authority... What is rabbinical charisma? Does the authority derive from the institutionalized form or from the charisma of individual leaders? Let's go to the next one. I mean, the Chavetz Chaim is the Chavetz Chaim. Was he a gadol because now he's a member of the Moshe Gedolei Torah? Because he got Chavetz Chaim. You see what I'm saying, right? One thing is for sure, without personal charisma, it doesn't mean anything. Accordingly, if he was just set up a Moetzes Chachmei Torah with a bunch of figureheads, wouldn't have anything. So Rav Shach endeavored to persuade Rav Ovadia Yosef to join and head this new Moetzes Chachmei Torah. Herein lies a tale within a tale. Ovadia Yosef, if you know anything about his career, had been elected Sephardic chief rabbi of Israel in 1973 in a very controversial close election where he displaced a sitting chief rabbi, which is something that's not done. Okay? So you go to the next one. You used to have Rav Nisim, who was a Talmid Chacham. For various reasons, they didn't like him. And Ovadia Yosef was able to get a majority. Again, it was like 80 to 60, something like that. It was not a landslide at all. And they forced Rav Nisim out. Okay? Now, I'm not saying Ovadia Yosef is not a Bar Hochi. And I would even go so far as to say that this is just for the Yom Kippur War. And when the Yom Kippur War came, Ovadia Yosef became a rock star. Because, among other things, he found the heter for the 1,000 agunas left over from Yom Kippur War. That's not the only reason, but that's a big one, okay? So Ovadia Yosef is a giant. But nevertheless, he left a lot of bad ruffled feathers. And it brings into relief the weird nature of this institution called the Chief Rabbinate of Israel. Because he was a Sephardi chief rabbi. Are there term limits, as we would say today? Are there elections? I mean, let's put it this way. When Rav Kook became the chief rabbi of Eretz Yisrael, they didn't have no elections afterwards. He's in. Same thing with Rav Herzog. I mean, somebody's a gadol, there for life. Ovadia Yosef was a big rabbi long after this episode in his life. The politics is always a big part of the chief rabbinate. He stabbed Rav Nisim in the back. That was in 73. By 1983, his Ashkenazi co-equal, Rabbi Gorn, was very controversial. They want to get rid of him. How do you get rid of him? Have to pass a law saying there's term limits. Now, really it's supposed to be 5-year term limits, but because of war or something like that, so they had skipped the elections. So now they want to pass a new law which goes like this. There's term limits from now on, and the 2 existing rabbis, they're already in for 10 years, they have to leave. Well, that's very controversial. They really were out to get Rabbi Gorn. Ovadia Yosef says, keep me out of this. And he pushed real hard politically that he should not be part of this particular phenomenon. Now, these are legal laws passed in the Knesset. Unfortunately, for Ovadia Yosef, who was the head of the Department of Justice, the Attorney General, the Minister of Justice in 1983? The guy on the left is Moshe Nisim, the son of Chief Rabbi Yitzchak Nisim. Okay? And he said like this, you did it to me? And he put in Mordechai Eliyahu. Right? Now there's more to this. It has to do with Ben Ish Chai and Moran. I won't get into that. This is how the political business works. And so, by 1983-84, Ovadia Yosef found himself in a very funny situation. Retired gadol. Right? Former chief rabbi of Israel. What do you do with that? So you see, it's almost like a godsend. The Rav Shach called him in and said, I guess I want to offer you a new career. And to be head of Shas, Moetzes Chachmei Torah. And he took it. Now, again, Rav Shach had in mind, I have the data, and you guys will follow me. After all, the Sephardim know, the Ashkenazim know better than them. Like you saw in the movie. Now, here comes the better part. Once all these things were in place, came the elections in 1984, Rav Shach then said, all those who hold by me, all the Litvisha, don't vote for the Aguda in the election, vote for Shas. Whoa, this is a shock. I mean, the Aguda party was a party Like in America, we think the good party is part of the yeshiva world. That's not in Israel. And here's the guy, the man who runs the yeshiva world, their leader, who says, do not vote for the Aguda, vote for this new Sephardic party. And they did, because he was that kind of a leader. And the result was that this new party of Sephardim got a lot of Ashkenazi votes of the Rav Shach type, and that's how they're brand new. They were able to get 4 votes, which is a lot, 4 seats. For a starting party, is 4 seats. And so, he turned over upside down the Israeli political world, and Rav Shach was seen as a political master, political tactician, because he got twice as many votes as the Aguda. Sweet revenge. In 1984, the Aguda, which now was only the Hasidim, but was deprived of the Litvish vote, so instead of getting 4 like they usually got, they got 2. Then Rav Shach got his own personal party, got 4. And thus it was that a peculiar set of circumstances emerged where Rav Shach, the strong ideologue, controlled a party that was an important component of the Israeli government. Now, not vital. If you recall, 84 to 88 was the National Unity Government, Peres and Shamir, the 2 parties. Actually, secular parties had plenty of votes in their own, 44 and 41. So the 2 parties, Likud and Labor, had 85. But they brought the front parties on board. The Sephardim, for the first time, started to get serious money. Not what they wanted, but a lot more than they'd gotten before. This is very important in terms of future of Israeli history, because what it meant was that the understandable ethnic resentment that the Shas rode was channeled in a frum, I would even say even a Haredi direction. I mean, what's the story of that movie? That guy wants a situation where, doggone it, you have to let my daughter into Beis Yaakov. That's not exactly Karl Marx over here. You understand? It's not trying to turn over the whole system. I want to be more comfortably accommodated within the system. So it means that the Sephardic resentment, and there's a lot of Sephardic resentment, justifiable, ever since 1948, as we know, the way we were treated, was channeled in a Haredi direction, which none of the political scientists foresaw, and they wrote endless books and conferences like, what happened? There's supposed to be a left-wing movement, and we're supposed to give a huge socialist trend from the, embittered masses, where actually the masses went in some kind of a black hat direction, right? And the potential was launched for a party that could gain many more votes in the future. I mean, 15 years later, the Shas got 17 votes, right? In other words, I mean, that's huge, just for one party. Rav Shach created a possibility of what I call a black hat party that could grow a much larger than the Aguda could ever hope to, and which could play a substantial role in national politics well beyond the sectoral level. If you got 17 votes, 20 votes, you're a kingmaker in Israeli politics. I mean, you could get like one of the big ministries, you know. And of course, as Shas won more and more seats, because they got 4 the first time, next election they got 6, next time they'll get 8, something like that, until they went to 17. Once you start gaining those kind of seats, all the secular politicians kissed up to them and were willing to listen to their advice and point of view. Shimon Peres, Yitzhak Rabin, you know. All of a sudden, Rav Shach and Ovadia Yosef became media stars. They want to be, all the journalists want to go there. They write books about them. They've been around for a long time. What's happens now is a politics, it's a power, you see. The problem was, of course, what exactly was the Haredi position on secular national affairs? I mean, what is their position on military and diplomatic issues, on economic issues, macro and micro, on social policy issues? In other words, what is the Haredi position on non-sectoral issues? Now, the front position, of course, is the Torah's answers to everything. Okay. How does one ascertain that? Of course, the Litvaks will say like this: you follow the Das Torah Rav Shach. That's whatever he said. But what if other big rabbis think differently than him? It's an interesting question. I think you can see that tonight I've started to scratch the surface. A very fascinating but very deep phenomenon. But I think that enough time has passed that I'm going to let it go and pick this question up next year. And so, with that, leaving you hopefully hanging, I bid you a good night, and we'll see you next Motzei Shabbos.